Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Thanks so much for being here with us today. We have a pretty darn good show for you today. 2 hours with Jimmy Akin, senior apologist here at Catholic Answers. The creator of both the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, one of the most popular documentary podcasts in the world, and the Jimmy Akin podcast, and the author of The Bible is a Catholic Book, A Daily Defense, and many other books. And all of our questions are already in because it's an internet Ask Me Anything with Jimmy today. Jimmy gets about, let me try to carry the 3.7 billion questions from the internet each month. So we have a lot of fun from time to time getting him to answer some of those on the air. Jimmy Akin, welcome.
Howdy, Cy Kellett. How you doing?
Very, very well. I think 3.7 billion might be an exaggeration, but you do get a lot of questions. Director.
I do, yes, and I do my best to answer them.
That's a lot. That's a lot of work. But maybe we're helping you then. We'll get some of them taken care of on the air today. I'm going to try do my very best not to give out the phone number, but you know me, I might. But don't call because all the questions are already in. There's there's a lot of them to get to, so I'm going to get right to the questions. Nicholas. Oh, I forget. We get these, the internet names are good sometimes. So Nicholas Roman 940 asks this. Do Protestants receive the Holy Spirit in valid baptism? If so, then why would they need to be Catholic?
Well, Protestants, the church understands, do receive the Holy Spirit when they're baptized. They do have valid baptism. As to why they would need to be Catholic, well, baptism isn't the only thing one needs. Baptism is just the first of the Christian sacraments of initiation. The other two are confirmation and the Holy Eucharist. And unfortunately, in the Protestant community, with very few exceptions, they don't have a valid priesthood. And so even though they do have a valid baptism, because anybody can baptize, you need to be a validly ordained priest in order to confirm someone or in order to confect the Holy Eucharist. And so with very few exceptions, Protestants don't have valid confirmation. In fact, most of them don't even practice confirmation. Certainly many of them don't. And almost none of them have a valid Eucharist. So they're missing out on receiving Jesus Christ himself. In addition to the spiritual benefits of baptism, Jesus wants more for us than just valid sacraments of initiation, including baptism. He also wants us to have accurate doctrine, and that will help us get to heaven. And unfortunately, while our Protestant brothers and sisters do have a lot of good doctrine, it's not all completely accurate, and some of them have ideas that will make it harder for them to get to heaven. In addition, Jesus founded a church that he wanted his followers to be members of, and unfortunately, Protestants are not in full communion with that church, so they're missing out on some of the graces that Jesus wanted for his followers in that respect also. So yes, Protestants do have valid baptisms, and they do receive the Holy Spirit, but Jesus wants more for his followers than just the graces that are given to us in baptism.
Nicholas, thank you very much for the question, and probably didn't know it, but you got us started today, and thank you for that. This next one comes from TJ. TJ says, Protestants are claiming that the Book of James was written before the Council of Jerusalem, and together with Acts 15, shows that James doesn't understand the gospel because he emphasizes works. How would you respond?
Well, so the first thing to do is figure out the chronology of this claim. Is the basis for it even accurate? And so we need to date two events. One of them is the council in Acts 15, which took place at Jerusalem, and the other is the composition of the letter of James. Now, when it comes to the Acts 15 council, I think we have a pretty good estimate of when it happened. I've done extensive chronological studies in the book of Acts, tying it to various datable events and then estimating the dates for other passages where we can't tie it directly to a datable event. But it would appear that the Acts 15 council likely took place in mid-January of the year AD 49. Now, it could have been a little earlier than that. It could have been at the end of 48. It could have been a little bit later than that. It could have been, say, March of 49. But we'll use mid-January as an estimate. The harder thing to date is the letter of James. Now, there are different approaches to the letter of James. Some people think it should be dated late. Other people think it should be dated early. If you think that, as I do, that James the Just wrote it, then it has to be before his death, which took place in AD 62. So it would have to be before that. But it also appears to interact with ideas that are mentioned in St. Paul, particularly in Romans and Galatians, although it doesn't. James's letter doesn't have to come after those letters. It just has to come after the ideas that Paul was talking about started getting around, and that led to some misunderstandings of them. And everything else in the letter of James looks really early. And so I'd be inclined to go with an early date for the letter of James, since it appears to be interacting with ideas that St. Paul taught. We wouldn't want to date it earlier than St. Paul's first missionary journey. That's the first occasion when he really goes out and starts preaching in a big way in a lot of different places. And so the first missionary journey began in Acts chapter 13 and finished up at the end of Acts chapter 14 in the year 48, right before the Jerusalem Council. So if James's letter was written towards the end of the first missionary journey, after the ideas that St. Paul was popularizing started to get around and started to be misunderstood, then we might estimate that James was written sometime in AD 48, which would be just before the Acts 15 Council. That's the basis of this claim, thus chronologically seems to hold together. It's not impossible that James was written after the Jerusalem Council, but it looks quite possible that it was written before the Jerusalem Council. So let's just grant that and assume that the chronology of this claim is accurate, even though it's not certain. We then proceed to the next element, which is that the Protestant individuals that the listener is reporting are saying that James didn't understand the gospel because he emphasizes works. Well, I'd have to say that I think they are misinterpreting both James and Paul. The messages that James and Paul give about justification are actually compatible. They use language in slightly different ways, but if you study the way that they're using language, it's clear that there's actually no disagreement between James and Paul, certainly not on any fundamental matter. And that's also underscored by Luke in his account of the Acts 15 Council. He makes it clear that James was on board with the other apostles like Peter and Paul and Barnabas, and so there's actually not a substantive disagreement. What I find most surprising, though, is that the listener reports that it's Protestants claiming that the book of James was written early because James doesn't understand the gospel due to his emphasis on works. That's a very unusual claim for Protestants to be making. The overwhelming majority of Protestants accept the book of James as valid canonical scripture, as divinely inspired by God, and so they would not say that James misunderstands the gospel. They, in fact, most Protestants would say exactly what I did, that although James uses language slightly differently than Paul does, they're in fundamental agreement once you take that into account. And so I would say with most Protestants that I wouldn't agree with this claim. That would be the basics of what I would have to say, and exactly how I'd articulate the way that James and Paul fit together might be a little different than some in Protestant circles, but fundamentally, I think both groups, broadly speaking, very much agree that James and Paul did not contradict each other.
TJ, thank you very much for the question. I always like to hear the questions that have that Jimmy gets into the chronology. It's fascinating. It's also fascinating. I've read some of your articles, Jimmy, on how you get the chronology. It's really detective work. Like, yeah, it reads almost like a mystery novel kind of. This is how we know that this happened at this date. A lot of it's probably on your website, right?
Yes, a good bit is on my website. I also cover the dating of the New Testament books in it briefly,
Yeah.
but I hit all of them in my book, The Bible is a Catholic Book.
All right, we got to take a quick break. Right back with more Ask Me Anything of the internet variety. We've got lots and lots of questions from the internet for Jimmy Akin. Right back with more of that after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on, Catholic Answers Live will return in a moment.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Hi, this is Father Mike Schmitz. Please join me for Ascension's Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year here on EWTN Radio. We're going through the entire Bible and the Catechism in 365 days. If you've ever wanted to understand what it means to be Catholic and allow those truths to shape your life, this is for you.
Bible in a Year and Catechism in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz, tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest, both hours today, and we've got lots of questions from the internet for him. This one comes from Jas412. Is our time, well, I don't know what to make it. I'm interested to hear the answer to this. Is our time set in stone?
Well, I don't know exactly what JAS412 means, but I can imagine it meaning a few different things. If he means could our time be rewritten? I would say the answer is no. Once an event exists in time, then from an eternal perspective outside of time, it always exists. Now, that doesn't prevent there from being other timelines where people made different choices. But once a timeline exists, it just exists, and nothing can alter that timeline. Other timelines might branch off of it, but nothing's going to change that timeline. So I would say that our time is set in stone in that sense, that once it exists, it exists. But Jas may be thinking of something else, which is the role of free will in creating a timeline. And God, sometimes people will argue that we must not have free will since God foreknows the future. Well, really, properly speaking, as St. Augustine points out, God doesn't exactly foreknow the future. He's just outside of time, so he sees all of history all at once. He sees the past, the present, and the future, and they're all equally real to him and equally present to him. So he sees the free will decisions that people are making at every single moment in time. And consequently, free will is compatible with God's knowledge. And so our time is not set in stone in the sense that fatalism is true and that there is no actual free will. The Catholic Church would say people do have free will. They have what's called libertarian free will in philosophical circles, and they can make choices that could have gone other ways. And if they had made choices that went other ways, well, we'd have a different timeline than the one we do. And so our time is not set in stone in that sense. It is set in stone in that once it exists, from an eternal perspective, it always exists, but it is not set in stone in the sense that people could not have made other choices and had history work out differently.
Jas, thank you for the question. This one comes from Bill. Bill asks, if Marian apparitions are private revelation, why does the Church recognize apparitions such as Our Lady of Guadalupe on the church calendar?
This is something that then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger addressed back in the year 2000 in a document that the Vatican published called The Message of Fatima. And he noted that even though private revelations are private revelations, they don't have the authority of public revelations, it's still possible for them for private revelations to leave an impact on the consciousness of the church and even on the liturgical calendar. So if popes want to promote a particular private revelation, like Our Lady of Guadalupe, they can put it on the general calendar. Or if popes don't, local bishops' conferences or even local bishops could put it on local liturgical calendars. So the lesson I would draw from that is that the church's liturgical calendar is not all a matter of dogma. It's not all a matter of bind-in public revelation. There are a lot of things from public revelation that are on the calendar, but the calendar also includes things that are not bind-in and authoritative in the same way that dogmas are. For example, there's no command that we celebrate the birth of Christ, and we don't know for sure when Christ was born during the year. That's a debatable matter. But that doesn't stop us from having Christmas as a day on which we commemorate the birth of Christ. Even though it's not a dogma that we need to celebrate Christmas, and it's not a dogma that he was born on December 25th. So our liturgical calendar, by its nature, includes non-dogmatic things. And if it includes non-dogmatic things, then it could include things like, hey, we're going to celebrate Our Lady of Guadalupe on this day, even though it's something that you could say, I don't think that was a genuine apparition. I think that that had a natural explanation. You could say that, but as a group, the church can still determine, but we're going to celebrate it and we're going to do it on this particular day, even though you're personally free to disagree.
All right. Thank you very much for the question, Bill. This one comes from Bryant. What are your thoughts on the studies done that aim to determine if prayer is an effective medical tool? I'm referring specifically to prayer groups praying for the patients and not the patients themselves. Also, if a non-Christian group prayed for the patients and it was shown to be effective, what would this mean?
Okay, so it's worth talking about the types of experiments that Bryant is referring to here. There have been quite a number of studies done of the effectiveness of prayer, and, they show different things. Some show more efficacy, some show less efficacy, some show random chance, so it varies from one study to another. It's good that Bryant clarifies this is where someone other than the patients are doing the praying, because now they may be praying too, but some, because if you have a serious medical condition, you may start praying. But what they're looking at in these studies is not the prayers of the patients for themselves, but the prayers of other people for the patients. And that's important methodologically, because if you were just looking at the outcomes of people who pray for themselves versus people who don't pray for themselves, and you weren't taking into account, you weren't looking at what other people's prayers might be doing, then you could, if you saw that the people who prayed got better, you could say, oh, it's the placebo effect. By praying for themselves, people are getting into a state of expectation and hope, and that's triggering their own body's healing ability. So it doesn't really tell us about, could there be anything preternatural or supernatural going on here. It could all just be natural. It could be people, they get them into a state of cells into a state of expectancy and hope, and they start healing better because of the placebo effect. So what you want to do is you want to look at what do other people's prayers do. And here you also need to introduce a concept that is very common in medical tests, which is blind-in. If, in a medical test, you need to divide groups, you need to divide the test subjects into two groups, a control group, which does not receive a treatment, and a test group that does receive a treatment. And the individuals in both groups need to not know which group they are in. And so in the case of prayer, you divide people up into two groups, and you'd have others praying for one of the groups but not the other. And it's important that the people in the two groups don't know if someone else is praying for them or not. Because if they do know, it could just be placebo effect. They could say, "Oh, well, I know someone's praying for me, and that gives me comfort, and that helps me relax, and that gives me hope and expectancy." And so it could just be the placebo effect. So this needs to be a blind experiment where the test participants don't know if they're being prayed for or not. So there has been a considerable amount of work done on this. Probably the most famous person researching this is a medical doctor named Larry Dossey. He wrote a book called Healing Words, among other books. And there have been a lot of, in addition to Larry Dossey, there have been other people looking at it as well. One of the problems with this area of research is it's hard to control for all the variables that are in play. Like I mentioned, even if you have people, who are doing the praying for the patients, well, you don't know who else is praying for the patients. Maybe there's a church group somewhere that's praying for them in addition, or maybe their own relatives are praying for them, or maybe they themselves are praying for themselves. And so because you don't know who is doing all of the praying, that limits the effect size that you would expect to see. You don't know where the effect is coming from. And it's just hard to figure out how much prayer is going on for patient X compared to how much prayer is going on for patient Y. And so because of that, I'm not surprised that we get different results in these studies, with people showing more efficacy in some studies and less efficacy in others, and some not showing a difference between the control group and the test group, because you don't know how many people are out there praying for the people in your control group. So in particular cases, there may be a lot of people out there praying for the people in your control group. They're just not registered in your study. And so you might not see a difference between them, between the control group and the test group. But there are other studies where you do see a notable difference. And if you look at meta-analyses, which are studies that look at multiple other studies and try to integrate their results, it does appear that there is a net benefit to having people praying for medical patients. Now, one of the things that a lot of these studies do not take into account is what is the religion of the people who are doing the praying. They may have prayers, people who do the praying, who are Christian or Buddhist, and they may be mixed in the same study. The kind of research that I have not seen done would be research that tries to test the efficacy of prayer based on the religion of the people doing the praying. As far as I know, that hadn't been tested. And so if it turned out, and by the way, if it did turn out that some religious prayers are more effective than others, let's say Christian prayers are more effective than Buddhist prayers, and you've got a mixed population of praying people, in a given study, well, that would bring down the results of that study compared to a study that, had only Christian prayers in it. So that could be another reason for the mixed nature of the results here. On the other hand, let's suppose you do see an effect from people regardless of what religion they are. How would you explain that? Well, you could explain that in any number of ways. One way would focus on the humans and say maybe humans have some kind of innate healing ability that they're able to project at a distance. And it doesn't matter what religion you are, you can project that healing ability. In which case Buddhists would be able to project it, and Christians would be able to project it, and Jews would be able to project it, and so forth. On the other hand, you could look at it another way on the divine level and say, God loves everybody. And even if you don't understand God exactly correct, he still loves you, and he still understands you're trying to reach out to him and trying to do good in the world, and he will respond and help out, even if you don't understand him perfectly, because he just loves people.
I always like the God loves you answer, Bryant. Thank you very much.
That's why I saved it for last.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah, but one thing I do, this is part of what you do, Jimmy, that I think people appreciate. There are natural possibilities, there are supernatural possibilities, and you gotta, if you're gonna make a full appraisal of the situation, you gotta acknowledge, well, it could be this natural thing or that natural thing. I would like to have a natural ability where I could project healing to others. I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, right. Who wouldn't? Healing Man from DC Comics. Thanks very much for joining us. We got Jimmy for 2 hours, and it's Ask Me Anything. And all the questions have come from the internet. Of course, Jimmy has lots of ways that people get in touch with him on the internet. You can always get in touch with us here just by sending an email to radio@catholic.com. You can find Jimmy on YouTube. He's got his own YouTube channel there. You can also get his podcast. Well, you can see him on other people's podcasts like ours. But his podcasts are Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which you can get wherever you get podcasts, or go to mysterious.fm. Or you can also find the Jimmy Akin podcast, again, wherever you get your podcasts, or check it out on Jimmy's YouTube channel. We've got to take a very, very quick break. I know all the questions are going to wait because they're on a piece of paper in front of me. Right back with more Jimmy Akin. We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, of morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
Our Lord needs articulate defenders of the truth to spread the joy of the Catholic faith. Catholic Answers monthly giving club, Society 315, helps you fulfill the call in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to make a defense for the hope that is in you. For as little as $10 a month, you'll help Catholics grow in faith, bring lapsed Catholics home, and lead non-Catholics to the truth. Go to casociety315.com and join today.
From its earliest days, Catholic faith has been lived by a yearly cycle of feasts and seasons. The new book from Mike Aquilina and Adam Lucas, Feasts of Our Fathers, is a one-stop companion for praying and meditating through the holy days and seasons of the Church with help from the most ancient Christian people. Don't just read about the early saints, pray with them. Order your copy of Feasts of Our Fathers now at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin, our guest. Lots and lots of questions in because it's an internet Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. And let me find my place. Mike wants to know this. If the Catholic Church doesn't accept a Mormon baptism because of their understanding of God, why does the Catholic Church accept a marriage when the people involved have a misunderstanding about the nature of marriage? It doesn't line up with our beliefs about marriage. He puts that in parentheses. That must be an example.
Yeah, well, the answer is the church doesn't accept a marriage if people don't understand it in a way that's at least open to the Catholic understanding of marriage. Now, that doesn't mean they have to believe everything that the Catholic Church believes about marriage, but they need to at least be open to what the Catholic Church believes about marriage. So, for example, if two non-Catholics get married, so they're not bound, since they're non-Catholics, they're not bound to observe the Catholic Church's laws regarding marriage, then the Church will presume that their marriage is valid until the contrary is proven. But it is possible to prove the contrary. For example, let's suppose in a particular marriage, one of them wants to become a Catholic and they've gotten divorced, and so they need the Catholic Church to look at their previous marriage and see was it valid or not? If so, are they currently free to marry someone else? Well, if it turns out that, yeah, back when my non-Catholic spouse and I, a non-Catholic, got married, we didn't think marriage had anything to do with children, and we weren't going to have children. We had our wills set to we are just never going to have children, and we were going to take active steps to avoid having children. We were not open to children. Well, that's one of the things about a marriage that is essential to it, being at least open in some situations to having children. And if you're fundamentally closed to children, then you're not agreeing to marriage, because that's not what a marriage is. A marriage is a union of a man and a woman. It's a partnership of the whole of life, directed towards the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. And if you say, no, we're not going to do any of that procreation and education of offspring, then whatever you're agreeing to, it is not marriage. And so consequently, the Catholic Church would look at that situation and say, yeah, they were excluded an essential quality of marriage. And so they didn't actually get married because they didn't actually agree to marriage. So that's not to say that, you have to be planning on having children. Like there are people who get married who are infertile, or who get married after a certain age, or who have ongoing, concerns like medical problems or things like, or, financial, whatever. They have problems where they're not in a position to raise children and they don't see that changing. So, so they may not be planning on having children, but they would be open to having children if, say their circumstances changed. Well, okay, in that case, the people were in principle open to having children, and so that marriage would be valid. And that's just one example. There are other examples of where a person might exclude an essential property of marriage. But if you exclude an essential property of marriage, even though you're a non-Catholic, you're not agreeing to marriage. You're agreeing to something else. And so the church does not accept people who have any kind of crazy claim that they call a marriage. The church isn't going to accept it unless it's at least open. What they're agreeing to is at least open to the essential properties of a marriage.
Mike, thank you very much for that question. This one comes from Eric. Jesus sent his disciples to heal the sick, expel demons, purify the lepers, and resurrect the dead. Matthew chapter 10. Why do we not hear much about the resurrection of dead people, but only of exorcism and healing of sickness?
Okay, so it's always helpful to look at the text because when many people think of Jesus sending out the disciples to do various miracles, raising the dead is not mentioned in all of these passages. But it is mentioned, as Eric says, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 8. There, Jesus tells the disciples, heal those who are sick, raise the dead. So there's the raising the dead, cleanse lepers, expel demons, freely you have received, freely give. So Jesus is commissioning them to raise the dead. So why don't we heal about that as much as we hear about them doing other things like healings and exorcisms? I think the reason for that is at least twofold. The first one is people may get sick, threefold. The first one is people may get sick or possessed, for that matter, multiple times in their lives, but they only die once, at least under ordinary circumstances. So sickness and possession are actually, sickness at least is more common than death. So death doesn't happen as often. The second reason has to do with Jewish culture at the time regarding death. Once you died, they buried you really fast. They would basically bury you the same day. They didn't do embalming the way we do or the way the Egyptians did. The Egyptians embalmed people, but Jews didn't. They just buried you. So when someone died in first century Judaism, even if they knew about the apostles being sent out on a mission with a mandate to raise the dead, probably you don't got an apostle within earshot when your family member dies, and there are no cell phones. They can't call you and say, hey, my brother just died, can you come try to raise him from the dead? So if there wasn't a disciple who had been authorized in this way around at the time the person died, they were going into the ground the same day. So the second reason would be they didn't keep you around for very long after you had died. The third reason, I think, is that this is a more major miracle, and so it's going to happen less often than miracles of healings or miracles of exorcism. So I think that those three reasons are why we don't hear about it as much. We do hear about it, like in the book of Acts, for example. Peter raises a woman who has died named Dorcas. And it's a really touching scene where he's not there at the moment she dies, but they are able to get him quickly enough. And when Peter arrives, they have people who are sitting around, they've washed the Dorcas body, they're keeping her company, and they're actually showing stuff that she sewed when she was alive. So that's like, she sewed this apron and she sewed this handkerchief and things like that. And I just find that so touching. And, they're showing these things that she did when she was alive. And then Peter shows up and he does raise her from the dead. So we do hear about this, but I think it's less common that we hear about it. One, because sickness is more common than death. Two, because Jews didn't keep you around long after you died, and they didn't have a way to contact you usually. And three, because it's a more major miracle that we would expect to happen less often.
Eric, thank you for that question. Thank you very much. The next question comes from Hail Holy Queen. Thanks for your important work, Hail Holy Queen says. Could you explain how the Old Testament practice of sacrificing an animal, then eating it, is really a sacrifice?
Okay, so in order to answer this question, we have to distinguish between two different people who do the eating. And the two categories of people are priests and laity. Now, if I'm an ordinary Israelite, and let's say I want to sacrifice a sheep, I can, and I want this to be a complete sacrifice, a whole offering, then I don't get to eat from it. And so I personally sacrifice the entire sheep. I take it to the temple, I cut its throat, the priests do the rituals that they need to do with its blood and its flesh and so forth, and I don't have any more part of that sheep. But since priests have a right to earn their living from the temple, they are able to eat the sheep, but that doesn't stop it, at least the right parts of it. They're allowed to eat those parts as part of their payment for working as priests. But that doesn't stop it from being a sacrifice to me. I gave up the whole sheep, and I don't have any benefit from it after that in a material way. The priests may get some material benefit, but that's between them and God. This is how God compensates them for their service at the temple. But it's a sacrifice to me. On the other hand, there are some sacrifices, what are commonly known as fellowship offerings, where the laity do get to eat from the sacrifice. And the whole point of a fellowship offering is it's a celebration of fellowship or friendship between man and God. It's like in Lord of the Rings, the fellowship of the ring is the friendship of the ring. If you have fellowship with someone, you have friendship with them. And so the purpose of a fellowship offering is to celebrate and reinforce the friendship between God and man. And one of the ways in ancient culture that people did create and enforce and celebrate friendship was by having a common meal. And so it would be perfectly understandable, and someone would have to pay for that meal, but then both parties would get the benefit of the meal. So like if I want to establish or celebrate friendship with my neighbor, I might throw a party where I say, okay, let's sacrifice a sheep or let's kill a sheep, and then we'll both get to eat from it. My family will get to eat from it, and your family will get to eat from it, and I'm paying for it, but it'll celebrate our friendship. Well, they would do the same thing, only they would with each other, and they would do the same thing with God. They would say, okay, I want fellowship with God, I want friendship with God, so I'm going to take a sheep and I'm going to go to the temple and say I want to offer a fellowship offering, which is different, for example, than a whole burnt offering. And so I'm going to kill the sheep, I'm going to cut its throat, and then we're going to divide up the sheep, and God gets certain parts of it that are going to be burned for him, and they go up to heaven. But others are going to be eaten by people here on earth, including my family, because the point of this offering is to celebrate and reinforce and cultivate friendship with God. And so for that reason, we both, even though I'm paying for it, I am making a sacrifice in that sense. I and my family do get some material benefit from it because of the symbolism of it. God and us are sharing a meal together, and that's a symbol of our friendship together. And that's what I'm trying to cultivate. So it is a sacrifice. It's just not a total sacrifice in the sense that I, as the one offering it, do get some benefit from it. But there are other kinds of sacrifices where I, as the person offering it, get no benefit from it, and I'm not allowed to eat of it because it's a different kind of sacrifice.
Hail, Holy Queen. Thanks very much for the question. Lots more questions to come. Jimmy Akin, our guest. We got to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more Ask Me Anything of the internet variety with Jimmy on Catholic Answers Live.
Hang on. We'll be right back with more Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul Street Evangelists out in the public square, sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
This is Jim Pinto, Director of EWTN Media Missionaries. EWTN's mission is to spread the eternal word and to teach others that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. You can help EWTN share the good news by becoming a media missionary. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today and join us in sharing the eternal word with the world.
Welcome back, Catholic Answers Live. Hey, we're offering the free Hallow app all year. This year, you can get the free Hallow app by joining Society 315. You can find out about Society 315 by going to casociety315.com or just Google Catholic Answers Society 315. Each new member this year gets a full year of the Hallow app for free. So check it out. Catholic Answers Society 315. Up next, for Jimmy Akin, a question from Chris, who wants to know this. Can you explain what Christian non-exclusivism entails? And more importantly, what the biblical and patristic evidence is that this is an acceptable, non-heretical position. I watched the Theology Unleashed videos you were in and feel like this position would change entirely how I see everyone, Christians and non-Christians. Also, are there not things like the infilling of the Holy Spirit and gifts of the Holy Spirit that devotees of other religious traditions cannot experience or share in outside of explicit faith in Jesus?
Okay, so we got quite a number of issues there, so let me take them one at a time. Could I explain what Christian non-exclusivism entails? Sure. It's normally called Christian inclusivism. And Christian inclusivism is the idea that there are people who can be saved and go to heaven, even though they're not consciously Christian in this life. This is a position that is taught by the magisterium of the Catholic Church, and pertaining to the second thing that is asked about, what is the biblical and patristic evidence that this is acceptable? Well, it's something that goes all the way back. If you look, for example, in the Old Testament, there are no passages that say, oh, you've got to be a Jew in order to go to heaven. Now, there's really not a discussion much of the afterlife in the Old Testament. I mean, it is there, but it's not we're not given a lot of information about it. But there are no passages that assume that non-Jewish people are damned. That's just not there. When we get to the New Testament, there are passages that emphasize that one needs to accept Christ, and you know that's important for our salvation. But there are other passages in the New Testament itself that can point in a non-exclusive understanding of that. For example, in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, St. Paul is talking to the Areopagus in Athens, and he notes that that the Athenians have been making offerings to God, because he found an altar in Athens that said, "To an unknown God." And he says, what you've been worshiping in ignorance, I'm now going to tell you about. So he acknowledged that the Athenians were worshiping God. They just didn't know about God, but they reasoned correctly. There must be a God we're not otherwise aware of, so let's make sure we worship him too. That was a good thing. St. Paul also talks to them about how, even though they have been led astray to worship idols, which they shouldn't do, that those were times of ignorance that God has winked at. That's the term that's used in Greek. It means God's overlooking those. He's not going to hold you accountable for that. Provided, now that you have more knowledge, you do what you need to, which is worship Jesus. But notice that this is implying that up to now, they would have been able to go to heaven. They were worshiping God. They recognized there was a God. They were trying to worship him. They weren't responsible for the idols they also worshiped, and God thus winked at those times. And so this indicate some possibilities for salvation for people who weren't consciously Christian. The same is true for, Jewish people who never heard the message of Jesus in the first century. If Jews before the time of Christ were saved, and there were still Jews in good conscience, at the time of Christ or just after the time of Christ, and they never heard the message of the gospel, well, if they would have been saved before, they would be saved now. God's not going to go into their souls because they've never heard the message of Jesus and then rip out the sanctifying grace that was already there. So it's going to be possible for those individuals to be saved. And in Romans, at the beginning of the book, St. Paul talks about how Greeks who don't know the law of Moses nevertheless have moral principles, which Paul refers to as the law of God, written on their hearts. And he says their consciences alternately accuse them or perhaps even excuse them on the day when the judgment happens. So this text at least holds out a possibility that people who don't know God's law consciously, the way Jews did, may nevertheless be excused on Judgment Day. And this was the understanding of early Christians as well. There were a lot of early Christian authors who recognized that, hey, some of the Greek philosophers got really close to Christianity. They realized that we need to live in a moral way. They realized there must be this creator God. And they're almost like Christians before Christians, And so what was said by some of the early church fathers was, well, these anonymous Christians, people who didn't have the name Christian, but who nevertheless realized, there's a God, and we need to live in a moral way. We need to live in accordance with God's will. They were trying to live their lives according to reason. Now, in Greek, the word for reason is logos. And logos is also the Greek term that is translated word in John 1. So in the beginning was the Word, or in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And, oh, look, these Greeks are trying to live according to Logos. So even though they don't know about Jesus, they're still trying to live according to the Logos, and the Logos is Jesus. So they're trying to live according to Jesus and his will, even though they haven't been taught about Jesus. And so they also could be saved. And this is something that, goes all the way back, like I said, into the Bible and into the early church. People kind of lost sight of it for a number of centuries after the evangelization of Europe, because after Europe was majority Christian, it was just kind of assumed that if you weren't a Christian, it was through your own fault. And, you might be a Jew or a Muslim or something, but you'd heard about Jesus. And it was just kind of assumed it was your own fault if you hadn't embraced Jesus. Although there were other authors who said, we haven't really been treating all the Jews great, and maybe that's part of why they haven't accepted him. But what really changed this was the discovery of the New World, because prior to the discovery of the New World, people would consider, well, what if someone were like raised on an island or something and never heard about Jesus? And they speculated, well, maybe in that case, God would send an angel to preach to them and to baptize them. And then we find the New World, and there aren't just islands, there are continents with millions of people who have never heard about Jesus, and God has not been sending angels to preach the gospel to them, certainly not in very many cases. And so it looks like we need to look for another solution here, and that helped retrieve the idea that the early church fathers had explored about people being united to Jesus in a saving way without understanding that in this life. Just like the Greek philosophers, they would say, oh yeah, they're united with Jesus in a saving way because they're trying to live according to Logos, even though they don't have a full understanding of Logos. And so the discovery of the New World helped revive that teaching, which had been part of Christian tradition. And so that's the position of the Catholic Church today. Now, our inquirer, Chris, says he watched videos I did on Theology Unleashed. Theology Unleashed is a YouTube channel run by a gentleman from down under named Arjuna Gallagher. He's a Vaishnava, which means effectively he's a Hare Krishna. So he's a Hindu. And he has had me on a few times to do dialogue about, ask Christianity and things like that. And the Vaishnava tradition actually has quite a bit in common with the Christian tradition. They believe that there is a single God and that the essence of being in union with this God is love. That's the most important thing. And you do have personal conscious union with God for eternity. You're not absorbed into God or anything like that. That's not part of the Vaishnava tradition. Vaishnavism is a monotheistic version of Hinduism that believes in a single great creator that we are distinct from and who wants an eternal loving relationship with us. And love is the key, just like it is in Christianity. It's the greatest of the theological virtues. So there's a lot of commonality there. One of the differences is, they have reincarnation in place of purgatory. For Catholics, the way you get purified is purgatory. For them, the way you get purified is reincarnation. So that's a difference. But in terms of some of the broader principles, they're actually quite similar. Chris then says, aren't there things like the infilling of the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Holy Spirit that devotees of other religious traditions cannot experience or share in outside of explicit faith in Jesus? Here, the Catholic Church doesn't have a teaching. It teaches that we do receive these things as part of our Christian initiation and Christian life, but it doesn't say, and nobody else in the world ever gets them. I think if you want to hold that, yeah, they just don't get the infilling of the Holy Spirit or the gifts of the Holy Spirit, that's a defensible position. That's a position you can hold. But I also think that you could hold a position like St. Augustine and say, we are bound by the sacraments, but God is not. He can give his graces to anybody he chooses. And so if God chose to have the Holy Spirit indwell a person or give someone a gift in another religion, then God could do that. It's up to him to choose how he's going to distribute his gifts. In fact, Jesus makes the point that it's the Spirit who determines these things, not us, and it's not always fully predictable. So I would say there can be a reasonable difference of opinion here about whether and to what extent God gives spiritual gifts to non-Christians who are trying to reach out to him and please him, even if they don't understand him fully.
Chris, thank you so much for the question. Jimmy Akin, our guest this hour and next hour. So another hour coming up of Internet Ask Me Anything. Lots of fascinating questions, some interesting Internet names attached to those questions. And I am sure, I have confidence, lots of great answers from Jimmy Akin to come. Hang on, we'll be right back with more Catholic Answers Live, Internet Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin right after this on Catholic Answers Live. Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin with us this hour. Of course, the proprietor of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and the Jimmy Akin podcast, and you know him from a lot of other things. Sometimes we get all the questions, not all the questions, but lots of questions together from the internet, and we ask them of Jimmy, and that's what we're going to continue to do this hour. Thanks for coming back, Jimmy.
Oh, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
I'm really glad to see this next question comes from High King Turgon, the king of Gondolin.
Don't get to hear from him too often.
No, especially since the big war. It's nice to hear from Turgon again. And Turgon says, this is from a friend. All right. Another elf wants to know, I kind of want to convert. Oh, the friend says, I kind of want to convert, but Eucharistic ministers' hands touching hands and tongues and sharing the chalice are so yucky. What can I do about this hang-up?
Get over it. I mean, that's kind of the fundamental answer, but I can build that out a little bit to try to be of more help, which is what I want to be. Now, High King Turgon's friend says that he's concerned about Eucharistic ministers' hands. And I'm not sure if there's a kind of a preliminary issue I need to address. Now, the proper term is not Eucharistic ministers, but what most people mean by that term is extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, as opposed to the ordinary ministers, which are priests, bishops, priests, deacons, and instituted acolytes. And so I'm not sure, this is the first issue, I'm not sure if King Turgon's friend is drawing a distinction here between the hands of priests and other ordinary ministers of Holy Communion and the hands of lay people who are not, ordained or not instituted acolytes, who are extraordinary ministers. But frankly, there's no difference in terms of their hands. I mean, maybe someone has said a special blessing over a priest's hand, but that didn't change that didn't fundamentally change the quality of your hand. And so the only rational basis that I could think of for regarding an extraordinary minister's hands touching tongues and so forth as being yucky would be based on, concerns about germs. And those are going to apply to a priest's hands just as much as anybody else's. So I wouldn't draw a distinction on that subject. I think all humans we're all covered in germs. That's just part of life as a human. In fact, we're designed to be covered in germs and to actually have germs inside of us, not just on us, but we have our own personal microbiome that contains helpful germs, in fact, both in our guts and on our skin. And that's one reason you don't want to overuse, like with skin, you don't want to overuse sanitizers, because in addition to killing off the bad germs in your skin microbiome, you're also killing off the good ones that you need to help protect you. And so I wouldn't distinguish between priests and anybody else when it comes to this germ issue. We're all humans. We're all covered in germs. And that's the way it's meant to be. So I would say to that extent, one shouldn't have a unique concern about extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, because the same thing is going to apply to priests. And I suspect that this kind of germ direction is what High King Turgon's friend is thinking about, because the friend says that the friend is concerned about their hands touching other people's hands and tongues and sharing the chalice, and that's what's yucky. So it seems to be this germ direction that the friend is thinking about. Okay, so fine. So let's take the question on in those terms. In the case of sharing the chalice, which is a common way that the precious blood is distributed in the Latin Rite in this country, I think that there can be grounds for some concern here, because what they typically do is a minister of Holy Communion maybe a deacon, let's say, will be holding the chalice, and they'll let someone drink from it, and then they'll turn the chalice. They'll use a purificator to wipe the edge of the chalice, and then they'll turn it a quarter turn and give it to someone else. So what that means is after the fourth person in line, you're drinking from the same part of the chalice as somebody else, even though it's been wiped with a purificator. And well, purificators are purificators. They do remove many of the germs that are there, but they don't remove them all. And so I think that especially during cold and flu seasons, there can be a rational basis for not receiving from the chalice. And you know, if and for germaphobes who have those concerns year round, well, if you don't want to receive from the chalice, well, then don't. You know, you don't have to. In fact, I'll confess, I tend to be something of a germaphobe myself. I'm not as bad as I used to be when I was a kid, but I'm not required to receive from the chalice, and I don't. My own personal preference for how to receive communion is with a form of distribution known as intinction. And what happens in intinction is the priest takes, or whoever is distributing, but typically the priest, takes a host and dips it in the precious blood and then puts it directly onto your tongue. And if I had my druthers, and I'd rather have my druthers, to quote Little Abner, I would receive by intinction every single time. But intinction is not that common in the United States, especially with the current edition of the Roman Missal. So I don't normally get to do that. So what I do instead is I tend to receive only under the form of bread. I receive the host, but not the chalice. So let's look at the distribution of the host in terms of the germ transmission potential. Well, King Turgon's friend is concerned about ministers of the Holy Eucharist touching people's hands and tongues. But I think that concern should not be as great as the friend is thinking, because we have two modes of distribution of communion here: putting the host on the tongue and putting the host in the hand. Well, okay, ministers of Holy Communion, whether they're ordinary or extraordinary, they don't usually touch people's hands when they distribute Holy Communion. They typically hold the host between their thumb and forefinger, and they place it in the person's hand if the person comes up with their hands out. You know, they say the body of Christ, and then they put it in the person's hand, but they don't usually touch the person's hand. They also, if you notice, and this is very common these days, I see this all the time, whoever the minister of Holy Communion is, ordinary or extraordinary, they tend to use hand sanitizer right before they distribute. And so they don't really touch people's hands. And people's hands, although they can have germs on them, the chance of transmission of something harmful after the minister of Holy Communion has just hand sanitized and isn't really touching other people's hands, it's pretty low. The same thing I think is true for distribution on the tongue, because now I recognize it's a little different, but I don't think it's very high in that case either. Now, personally, this is just my preference. I have no problem if people want to receive in the hand, but my preference is to receive on the tongue, and I always receive on the tongue. So when I go up to Holy Communion, I open my mouth, and they say the body of Christ, I say amen, and then I open my mouth nice and wide, and I do that, and I stick my tongue out, and I do that partially because I've got facial hair around my mouth, and I want to make it easy for the minister of Holy Communion to place the host on my tongue. And what I can tell you doing that over and over and over again is they very seldom touch my tongue. It's just very rare that would happen. I can't say it never happens, but it's very, very rare. What I will occasionally feel is the host may brush my whiskers, like in my mustache, but they just don't touch my tongue. I mean, it can happen, but it's very rare. And so I would say that the odds of getting something problematic from, some kind of disease from germs involving the transmission of the distribution of the host, whether it's via the hand or on the tongue, is just very, very low. And so I would say that that I wouldn't worry about it, because what you're getting is Jesus himself. And so I would say to the friend of High King Turgon who wants to convert, go ahead and convert, and then you can receive Jesus Christ himself, and you get all the benefits of receiving Jesus Christ himself. And compared to the minimal chances of catching some kind of disease, I would say it's totally worth it. So in terms of the germ concerns, if you don't want to receive the chalice, especially during cold and flu season, well, then just don't. And the odds of disease transmission via receiving the host in the standard ways it's distributed today are just vanishingly low and do not compare to the benefits of receiving Jesus.
Hi, King Turgon. Thank you very much. I hope that was helpful to both you and your friend. We got to take a quick break. Jimmy Akin, our guest, back with more questions from the internet right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Stay with us for more Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
Catholic Influencers is a great podcast from Australia. It studies the weekly readings and breaks them down into layman's terms, showing you how they're relevant to our life today, making theology accessible for everyone. You can hear Catholic Influencers as well as faith-filled podcasts from our friends and affiliates around the world, all in one place. All free at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click Podcast Central today.
Jimmy Akin, our guest this hour on Catholic Answers Live, and all of our questions have come from the internet. It's an internet Ask Me Anything. This one comes from TJ. Do you have a response to Dr. Mark Miravalli's response about Medjugorje?
Okay, so I should probably explain what this is referring to.
Okay.
A few months ago, late last year, the Vatican finally published a ruling on Medjugorje. And I'd had people asking me about Medjugorje for years and years and years, but I hadn't really dug into it in a lot of depth. In part because I knew this response was in preparation, that the Vatican was going to be coming out with a ruling at some point, and I didn't want to do a whole bunch of research and then deal with it. I'd rather wait till the ruling came out and then I could react to the ruling. So that's what I did. And they finally came out with a ruling on Medjugorje, and they didn't really address the issue head on of, is it supernatural or not, because they tend not to address that these days. It requires special authorization of the Pope to actually look into that question and make that determination. But they did come out with given that it didn't deal with the issue of supernaturality, it was a pretty positive one. They said you need to set aside certain things, you need to understand certain things in a kind of careful way, but you can incorporate Medjugorje elements into your spirituality. And so that's what I talked about. I did for only the second time ever, I did a 3-parter on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where I looked in the first episode at the history of the Medjugorje reported apparitions. In the second episode, I looked at the Vatican ruling on them and went through that and what it said and didn't say. And then because I knew people wanted to know my own opinion about, is it supernatural or not, I went into that question in the third episode, and I made it totally clear, this is just my tentative opinion. I'm not wedded to this, but I tentatively came to a conclusion that was similar to the one that the Ruini Commission in Rome had come to, which was that the earliest Medjugorje apparitions were likely to be supernatural, but that the later ones were not. And so, but I could go either way on that, so I'm not wedded to that position, and I don't have any problem if anyone disagrees with it. Well, Dr. Mark Miravalli of the University of Steubenville is a noted Mariologist, and he's also a noted supporter of Medjugorje, and he has been for decades. So he's a big proponent of the idea that Medjugorje is supernatural, and that's fine. He then did his own video on YouTube where he responds to me, and that's totally fine too. I watched his video. I don't have any plans at the moment to respond to it. I think that I stand by the conclusions I came to. I don't think anything he said gave me a reason to change, the tentative conclusion I've come to. Certainly, I don't think that what he said would lead me to conclude his position, which is that the apparitions are all supernatural. I just don't see good evidence for that. I see significant evidence against that. He was very charitable, especially towards the beginning of his response. He said nice things about me. He acknowledged that I'm trying to do a good job here and be fair and balanced. And I acknowledge, the same thing for him. He's a noted scholar. He's as entitled to his opinions. He's trying to do good in the world. I think all that's true. He said he didn't want to find fault with me on a moral, personal level, although I think that as you listen to him towards the end of his response, he actually does start to do that a little bit. But, that's that. And he thought I accused him similarly of some personal moral faults. I actually didn't intend to do that. I made some observations that I understand how he could take them that way. It wasn't my intent to do that. And if I caused any confusion in that, I apologize. But given the difference of opinion here and the fact that I don't think that the material was devastating or anything like that, my inclination is to let the two things stand. I said my piece, he said his piece, and I'm comfortable in a marketplace of ideas where people can look at both cases and make up their own minds. So I don't have, and if I did have a response, it might descend into a little bit more personal judgments, which is actually what I want to avoid. So I'm more inclined to we both said our piece. People can watch what we said and make up their own minds, and I'm fine with that.
Thank you very much, TJ, for the question. We got time for another one. Before I got to take a break, we'll go to Melissa's question. Jimmy, I heard you state on a recent podcast that you have a particular interest in linguistics, so I'm hoping you can comment on the following issue. Why are some Old Testament names so familiar in modern English and others so foreign to us? Is it a matter of translation, the importance of the person, or something else?
Well, it is, and this is something I'm interested in. In fact, I once thought about getting a master's in linguistics just because I find the subject so interesting. And I read books about linguistics, and linguists have studied baby naming conventions a lot. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff. Like, for example, sometimes people will think that celebrities or famous characters on TV shows or in movies influence baby naming trends. Like, for example, our own producer is Darren. And some people thought that the name of Samantha Stevens' husband, Darren, on Bewitched, the 1960s sitcom, made the name Darren popular as a baby name. But when you actually study the census records that tell you, and birth certificates that show exactly when names were being given to babies, the causality is not always what people would think. For example, in the case of Darren, it looks like it wasn't Bewitched. It was the fact that, and this was more a phenomenon in England than America, as I recall, but the names that ended with the sound in, like Darein, they were just becoming more popular on their own before Bewitched ever came along. And so it looks like Bewitched didn't influence the name Darren. The reason Darren got popular was because it was part of a class of names that had that in final sound that were already becoming popular on their own. So there have correspondingly been studies of biblical names and their popularities over time. And the reason that some are more popular than others is partly due to, now Melissa mentioned some possibilities. She says, is it a matter of translation or the importance of the person or something else? Well, I think it's all three. One of the things is it's partly a matter of the translation, because these names, these biblical names, don't sound exactly in Hebrew and Greek the way they do in English. And so you can bring them into English in multiple different ways. For example, the root name that I have my name is Jimmy. That's my legal name. It's on my birth certificate. It's a Texas thing. But the Hebrew name that Jimmy comes from is Yaakov. And almost nobody today hears the name Yaakov. That would be very unfamiliar to an ordinary English speaker. You don't hear many people in America named Yaakov. You may hear some people named Jacob or Jacob or things like that, or James, another variation of the name. You don't hear so many named Jimmy, although it is a common nickname. It's not as common as a legal name. But translation is one of the reasons. If you translate Yaakov one way, just bring it straight into English, it's going to be unfamiliar. But if you translate it James, it's going to be much more familiar. So translation is part of it. Another part of it is the importance of the person that it's named after. We have a patriarch named Yaakov in the Old Testament, but we translate that Jacob. And because of how prominent Jacob is in the Old Testament, a lot of people have named their kids Jacob. We then bring the same name into English as James, and we use that when we're doing the New Testament. So you have, two Jameses among the 12 apostles, plus James the Lord's brother. So we've got multiple Jameses in the New Testament. Two of them, James the son of Zebedee and James the Just, are very prominent. And so because of that prominence, people are more likely to name their kid James than after some minor biblical figure. Like until a few years ago, almost nobody had heard of the Old Testament figure Jabez. And so there were very few people named Jabez, lots of people named James. And then Melissa mentioned something else. Yeah, there are other factors too. It's not just the translation. It's not just the importance of the person. There are also historical cycles that names follow. With some names like Max, it's been noted that Max is kind of a prominent example of one of these cycles. Until recently, everybody named Max was really old. It was common a few generations ago, but it became much less common. And then it started to become more popular again. And so today, the name Max is common in old folks' homes and kindergartens, but not so much in the middle. Stephen is kind of the opposite. Stephen used to be a rare name. Then it became very popular in the mid-20th century. Then it dropped off again. And so now Stevens tend to be adults. There are not as many in the old folks' homes and the kindergartens. But then there are some names like James and John that, in the words of one linguist, just will not go away. And so they tend to be with us always. So it's a combination of different factors.
Oh, fascinating. Melissa, thank you very much for the question. Crazy Dove. Is that right? Crazy Dove or Crazy Dove?
Yeah,
I'm going to go with Crazy Dove.
Either way.
I don't even know what this question means, so you have to tell me. What's the best evidence that psi phenomenon exists?
Okay, so psi is an abbreviation. It's not an abbreviation. It's a term that was invented in the 20th century to refer to psychic phenomena.
Oh, all right.
So if someone is claiming to display ESP, extrasensory perception, or they're claiming to be able to display psychokinesis or PK, which is mind over matter, then both of those would be examples of psi. The term psi doesn't mean anything. It's just the 23rd letter of the Greek alphabet. It's not an acronym for anything. And the 23rd letter was picked because it's the first letter in the Greek word psyche, which means mind or soul or consciousness. And since psychic abilities are supposed to be produced by the mind or soul or consciousness, it got picked as just an easy way to refer to them. So that's what psi phenomena are. And in terms of the best evidence, I'll talk about that on the other side of the break.
You can hear that music playing. It's a very short break, though, so if you want to find out what the best evidence for these psychic phenomena are, you just hang on. We'll be right back with Jimmy Akin. Have you ever wondered about the mysterious, even obscure aspects of the Catholic faith? Dive into the Jimmy Akin podcast, where Jimmy brings together information from many fields as he pushes the boundaries of apologetics. Tune in today to the Jimmy Akin podcast, Mysteries of the Faith, a highly entertaining, informative, and at times humorous show that will help you grow in your faith. Visit JimmyAkinPodcast.com today to subscribe.
Lots of people have big questions about Catholicism. It needs a big book of answers. And now it's got one. The Big Book of Catholic Answers is filled with helpful replies to more than 250 questions about the faith. Questions about God, salvation history, the Creed, the Bible, the list goes on and on. Order your copy of the Big Book of Catholic Answers today at shop.catholic.com or ask for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic. And Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
If you're not a Bible scholar, the full message of how the Sunday Mass readings fit together can be tough to comprehend. Apologist Carlo Broussard is here to help. Join Carlo every Friday for the Sunday Catholic Word podcast. In each episode, he unpacks the scripture readings for that Sunday and brings them all together so you can better understand and defend the faith. Visit SundayCatholicWord.com to subscribe. That's SundayCatholicWord.com.
Welcome back. Catholic Answers Live. Crazy Dove. First, we needed Jimmy to explain to us what the question meant. What's the best evidence for psi phenomenon, that psi phenomenon exists, and that just psychic phenomena of different kinds. And so what is the best evidence, Jimmy?
Well, I think that, so the best evidence is always statistical in nature, in science. And so what you want to do is you want to look at big pools of data that have generated, and not just one experiment. You want to look at multiple experiments that have been done, and see, what kind of evidence they provide. Now, there are several very large pools of data that have been generated looking at psi phenomena. One is that has been replicated. So these are not just single studies. These are things that look at multiple, very large numbers of trials. One is a set of trials that were done at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies, or PAIR lab. They did work both on remote viewing, which is a form of clairvoyance, and on psychokinesis. And they generated really startling numbers. Now, in the sciences in general, the 5 sigma threshold level. A sigma is the number of standard deviations away from the average that you have. And so nothing is statistically significant until it hits 2 standard deviations. At that point, you've got a 1 in 20 chance of the phenomena showing a 1 in 20 chance of the results being random. But there's still that 1 in 20 chance that they're just random, that there's no real phenomenon here. So 2 sigma is kind of considered the minimal threshold for statistical significance. By the time you get to 5 sigma, it is like millions to 1 against this just being random. And so kind of the gold standard that's used in many areas of science, like in physics, is if you've got 5 sigma significance, then you can announce a discovery. You know, we've really shown this. It's real. It is not just random. The odds are millions to 1 that further research would overturn this finding. Mm-hmm. Well, there have been series of psi experiments that have shown greater than 5 sigma significance, like 6 sigma, 7 sigma, things like that. And the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Lab is one of the places that has generated that. Another is a series of experiments that were initially done by a psychiatrist named Daryl Bem, BEM, who was not initially he didn't initially do work in parapsychology, but he was a very famous experimentalist who was very good with experimental design, and he was asked to comment on the experimental design of some parapsychological experiments, and he got interested in the field and started doing his own experiments. And what he did was he would take ordinary experiments that had been done in regular psychology and like make one little tweak in them that would turn them into a parapsychological experiment. So for example, one of the experiments he did, there were like 11 of them, but one of the things he did was he took a memory test from ordinary psychology. And the way this memory test works is they read you a list of random words, and then they divide the list in 2, and they give you half of the list, and you get to practice that half of the list. And then they do the test. So they've read you the full list, they've let you practice half the list, and then they test you on how many of the words you can remember. And it turns out, no surprise, you remember the ones that you were able to practice better than you remember the ones you were not able to practice. So that's the way the memory test ordinarily works in standard psychology. And they have all the, techniques for how to statistically evaluate the results. But this is the way the test works. It's not controversial. So what Daryl Bem then does is he flips the order of 2 steps. So in his version, first they read you the words, the list as a whole, then they test you on what you remember, and then they let you practice half the list. So you're actually doing the practice after you've been tested on what you remember. And it still turns out you remember the ones you would practice in the future better than the ones you would not practice in the future. It's like you're doing your homework after you've taken the test. And with this series of 11 experiments, now he ended up publishing a paper in a mainstream psychiatric journal on this. This wasn't some special publication. It was a very respected mainstream journal. It was called Feel in the Future. And he covered these 11 experiments, and he got statistically significant results in a bunch of them. And almost, I think all but one or something like that. And he got very high statistical significance. And people said, oh, this is impossible. This can't possibly be real. This all has to be replicated. Well, it so happens that what Daryl Bem had done was program his experiments into a computer package that anybody could download and run on their own computer. And so so that's what people did. After Feel in the Future, they started downloading this computer package, running the same experiments in their own labs, and they got the same results. And so you got extraordinarily high statistical significance for this. And, people started writing articles with titles like Daryl Bim has broken science, because he was using standard statistical means of evaluating these test results, and they were still producing results that materialists could not accept. And so I think that's really good evidence for psi. So I mentioned the Pear Lab, I mentioned Daryl Bim. Also, I mentioned the Stargate program, which was a program that the Defense Department operated. It involved, again, remote viewing or clairvoyance. It was run between the 1970s and the 1990s. And at the end of the project, the CIA, which was then in charge of it had left the Defense Department, wanted a statistical review done. Now, they don't really already decided they were going to close it down, but they wanted a statistical review done. And so they hired 2 individuals to do that review. One was Professor Jessica Utz, who is a statistician, and she's even been the head of the American Statistical Association. So she's very highly qualified, and she's open to psi. The other individual they hired was a skeptic. He's a psychiatrist named Ray Hyman. And so they wanted both perspectives, someone who's open and someone who's skeptical, and they had them review the evidence. And they only had a limited time. They could only look at a limited selection of the data. But Jessica Utz, in her evaluation, concluded psi has been proved as effectively as anything else in science, that the data is just there, that it exists in her view. So that was the open person's position. What about the skeptic? Ray Hyman, in his evaluation, concluded that based on the Stargate data that they reviewed, that the evidence looks as promising for psi as it's ever looked, that it deserves further research. And even though Hyman at the time was not willing to say that psi has been proven, he said it looks extremely promising that it does, and he could change his opinion in the future if further research bore out the results of the Stargate program. So I would say that so I tend to cite that one because you've got a skeptic even admitting, I could change my mind on this because this looks really promising. So those would be 3 examples of positive evidence for the existence of psi in a scientific setting. Of course, there's no church teaching on this. So this is a matter of science, not a matter of doctrine. And if you think the scientific evidence supports psi, then that's fine. But if you think the scientific evidence does not support psi, that's fine too.
Crazy Dove, thank you for that question. I appreciate it very much. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back. We'll get some more questions to Jimmy Akin. Before we have to go, it's an internet Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin today on Catholic Answers Live.
You're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Proclaiming the faith, changing lives.
The year was 1999. The shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament of Our Lady of the Angels Monastery in Hanceville, Alabama is consecrated. Mother Angelica says the happiest day of my life was the day this church was dedicated.
To learn more about Mother Angelica's life and the history of EWTN, visit EWTN.com/Mother Angelica.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul? And that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come. At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Jimmy Akin is our guest, having fun with internet questions. Lots of great questions. And this one comes from Tally Ty 0326. If angels have been around since creation, but they don't reproduce, does that mean that it's the same number of angels since the beginning, no more and no less?
Well, prima facie, or on the face of things, that would seem to be the case. They don't reproduce, and they're immortal, so they don't pass out of existence, and that would be if you assume that they've all been around since creation, then it would seem that we've had the same number all the way down through history. Now, that's not. There are some possibilities that could deviate from that, like if God. What if they haven't all been around since creation? What if God makes them in batches, at different points in history? Well, then there could be more of them. They may not reproduce, but God may create more of them. And so that would be a possibility. That possibility does not have a lot of traction in Judeo-Christian thought. It tends to be assumed that they all got made at the same time. In fact, the non-canonical book of Jubilees, it's either Jubilees or First Enoch, but I think it's Jubilees, says that God made them all at the same time during creation week. He made all the spirits that exist, including human spirits, but he made all the spirits that exist wham on one day in creation week, and they've all been around since. And some of them, like humans, have gotten bodies, but angels don't. The only place I can think of in Judeo-Christian tradition which has envisioned new angels coming into existence is in the book of First Enoch, where Enoch, and I'm sure there are other examples too that are along these lines, but it's not in canonical literature. In Enoch, the biblical patriarch Enoch, who is a human, is sort of transmogrified or transubstantiated so that he actually becomes an angel. Specifically, as I recall, he becomes the angel Metatron. But even though the idea of humans kind of getting their wings, like Clarence in It's a Wonderful Life, has been there a little bit, this is not a prominent opinion, and it's certainly not something in Scripture. But hypothetically, if God makes angels in some other way, like creating them out of nothing or transmogrifying another being into an angel, then you could get more angels over time, provided it's done in stages after the creation. When it comes to the same number of angels remaining, well, okay, one thing that's obvious is that some angels are now demons, and that's because they fell into sin. And it's historically been common to assume in Christian circles that all happened at once. But if you want to say a demon, even though they're the same species, if I can put it that way, if you wanted to say that demons you're not going to count demons as angels, well, then we did lose a bunch of angels. And the standard account is that happened all at once, but there are other versions. In fact, it seems in the Hebrew scriptures and in Second Temple literature that it's assumed that the angels did not fall all at once, but that they fell in different stages. And St. Paul even seems to possibly envision a future stage where some angels might fall. That's not the traditional Christian view, but it is something that has to be thought about. But with angels turning into demons, that's just one possibility. Another possibility that would decrease the number of angels is if God annihilated some of them so that they cease to exist. But that idea really doesn't have a lot of traction in there are some individuals who may be annihilationists and will say that when God punishes the angels on the last day, they might be annihilated. That is not the Catholic Church's understanding. But there may be some people in the Judeo-Christian tradition who, more broadly, who would hold that. But I can't think of any books off the top of my head that actively endorse that possibility. There may be some, but normally it's understood that their punishment is going to be everlasting rather than annihilationist in nature. But I'd have to do a review of the literature to say with certainty.
All right, Tally Ty, thank you very much for the question. This next one comes from Stephen. How do those who desperately want a relationship with God, including prayers inviting all three persons of God to come into their heart, deal properly with an apparent lack of response from God?
Well, so this is something that I think everybody deals with to some extent, because there are all times when we want things from God, like a feeling of closeness to Him, that we don't immediately have. And so I think this is something everybody can sympathize with, because we all go through this at various points. The way I would say to deal with it is just trust Him. There are times where, oh, sure, I'd love to have a vibrant experience of the presence of God, but I don't need that in order to get through life. What I need is for God to take care of me. And so I will assume that, I'll pray to God, and then I'll just trust Him and say, He'll give me whatever I need. If it's going to help me to have a powerful experience of His presence, I'd love to have that. I definitely welcome that, but I'm not going to worry about it if I don't get that, because what I ultimately need is His care, not a powerful demonstration of His presence. And so I tend to not focus on my own emotions, on my own feelings. I treat emotions as things that if they come and I have a powerful emotional experience of God, well, that's wonderful. But I'm not going to expect it or demand it out of Him. I can live comfortably not having such experiences, and I would treat any ones that do come along as gifts, as as really nice things that God has done for me. But I don't expect or demand it, and I don't let it distress me if I don't have those experiences. And so I tend to partition my emotions. I mean, I have good evidence that God exists. And I do have a relationship with Him. I talk to Him, and He cares for me. But I don't let it worry me that I don't have particular kinds of particular manifestations of a relationship, like one where I feel a powerful sense of His presence. That's something that will come and go with time, but it shouldn't bug me if I don't have it at the moment. What's ultimately important is, does God exist? Well, yes, He does. I've got good evidence for that. Does He care for me? Yes, He does. I've got good evidence for that. And do I trust Him to take care of me? And the answer is yes, He does. I've got good evidence for that. So if I get emotional, warm feelings on top of that, that's a bonus, but it's not a requirement, because the important things are already taken care of. It's kind of like that old Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but if you try, you can get what you need. And what we need is God's providential care of us, and we'll have the wonderful, glorious emotional experiences in the future, and perhaps some in this life, but we'll definitely have them in the next life. And for now, we just need to press on and do what we can to love and serve God and our fellow human beings.
Stephen, thank you for that question. Next one comes from Pamela. How can days off purgatory be understood in the hereafter, since we live in a different, quote, time zone? And isn't the time frame of the purging a discretionary matter only God can determine?
Okay, so let's answer Pamela's second question first. Isn't the time frame of judge and purgatory something only God can determine? Yes, that would be the understanding, for example, of Pope Benedict XVI in his encyclical on Christian hope, Spes Salvi. When he talks about purgatory, he says it cannot be calculated in earthly time. So that's something only God can determine. We can't calculate it using our current systems of timekeeping. And that is why the church eliminated, back in the 1960s under Pope Paul VI, it eliminated the quote-unquote days that were associated with various indulgences, because they had come to be misunderstood. What those days, like let's say you had an indulgence of 300 days, what that meant was that your purgation would be relieved of the amount of penance equivalent to doing 300 days of penance here on earth. But what that meant in purgatory, nobody has any idea, because that's up to God. And so these were equivalents of earthly days of penance. but people didn't understand them that way. And so they had the idea, oh, I'm getting days off in purgatory. If I have a 300-day indulgence, that means I get out of purgatory 300 days earlier. And people misunderstood that. So the church decided, let's get rid of those days, because people are interpreting them as days off purgatory, and we can't say that that's what they are. We can, judge the strength of an indulgence in terms of what's it equivalent to in earthly days of penance, but we have no idea that that corresponds to time in purgatory. So precisely because only God can determine lengths of time or whatever in purgatory, the church eliminated the days in purgatory from indulgences to get rid of the idea that you're getting this number of days off in purgatory.
Pamela, I hope that was helpful to you. On we go to Katina's question. The Copenhagen experiment.
Oh, she's got such a good name, Katina Last.
Oh, I
4955.
I should have done the whole name. Sorry, Katina. Katina says this: the Copenhagen experiment, where they shot photons through slits. I think I have that right. And the particles behaved differently when they were observed versus unobserved. Does this offer any proof for God? Also, how does this work with weeping angels?
Okay, so this is what Katina is describing is what's known as a double slit experiment. The Copenhagen interpretation is one interpretation of the results of quantum mechanical experiments, but there are other interpretations besides that. So it's not the Copenhagen experiment, but this class of experiment is known as a double slit experiment. And it's true that if you fire particles that have quantum mechanical properties through the different slits, and you watch them or don't watch them, it influences the results of the experiment. So if you watch them to know which slit they're going through, then they're going to display properties as if they're particles. But if you don't watch what slit they go through, they're going to display properties like they're a wave. And so this is known as the wave-particle duality. You either get particle-like results or you get like wave-like results, depending on whether you measure whether they're going through the slit, which slit or not. Now, there are a lot of variations on that, but that's the basic idea of this experiment. So Katina asked, does this give us any proof for God? And the answer is maybe. The question is going to depend on the interpretation of quantum mechanics that you believe is true. And there are a whole bunch of different interpretations. None of them are definitive at this point. There's a robust debate in physics about what's the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. But there have been some physicists like Eugene Wigner who believed that the operation of consciousness is essential to the phenomena that we observe in the universe, because Wigner would say if you don't have a conscious observer, then you wouldn't see what we actually see in the universe. So like the moon needs a conscious observer to collapse from being just a possible set of states to an actual moon that's in a particular location. And one could then make an argument, and actually Wigner did argue in this way, that you need a kind of cosmic consciousness in order to produce the universe that we see around us. And I have a similar argument that I pose in my book, A Daily Defense, where I propose for consideration a quantum mechanical argument for the existence of God that proceeds along lines similar to Wigner's argument. On the other hand, not everybody has this interpretation. When it comes to weeping angels, the problem with them is they are quantum locked if you're looking at them. And that doesn't really tell us anything about the existence of God. It only tells us that if you see a weeping angel, don't blink.
All right. Katina, thank you very much for the question. Thanks to everybody who got their question to Jimmy one way or another. Jimmy Akin, thank you. Enjoyed the 2 hours.
My pleasure. And don't blink. Really, don't blink.
I can't not blink if you say don't blink. All right, well, that'll do it for us. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Live. I'm trying not to blink.